There are stories that begin softly, almost like a distant sound carried by a cold wind, and it takes a moment for the listener to understand that what they are hearing is not just a tale, but a reflection of their own restlessness. This is one of those stories. It starts in a land where winter lingers, even when summer has technically arrived, where the sun can shine for hours without truly warming the skin, and where a man chose to build a life not out of stubbornness or exile, but out of a quiet devotion to simplicity. People sometimes imagine that a solitary man living among Alaskan mountains must be running from something or hiding from someone, but that is only because most have forgotten how to want their own company. This man, the one whose steps trace paths through snowfields as if writing on blank paper, does not feel burdened by the silence around him. Instead, he feels enriched by it, as if every gust of icy wind were a reminder that life is easier to understand when you strip away the noise that chases you in the cities. I remember the first time I walked beside him on one of those long paths that stretched toward a ridge of pale blue ice. He did not rush, he did not speak unless the words came naturally, and when he did speak, his voice carried the calm assurance of someone who had already had every argument he needed to have. The mountain was not a challenge to him. It was a companion. The snow was not an obstacle, but a familiar surface on which he had learned to read signs, patterns, and stories that others overlooked. He admired the smallest details, the faint shift in the weight of the air before snowfall, the way the color of the sky changed a few degrees before the cold deepened. To an untrained eye, these were trivial things, but to him they were threads that formed the tapestry of a life lived intentionally. He once told me that people often asked him why he stayed there when the winters grew harder, when storms rolled down the slopes with the force of falling cliffs, when the rivers froze so solid that even the sound of water seemed to retreat into hiding. He would laugh a little, not because their question was foolish, but because the answer was too large to fit in quick conversation. The truth, he said, was that the mountain had given him something that the world below had forgotten how to offer. It had given him space to feel. It had given him room not only to breathe, but to listen to the rhythm of his own heart without interference. And even though this choice confused many people, he never once doubted it. Life above the tree line does not unfold in predictable patterns. Sometimes you wake to a morning so silent that you feel the entire mountain holding its breath. Other times, the wind barrels against your shelter with a force that mocks anything built by human hands. He loved both kinds of days. He said the quiet mornings allowed him to think about the person he used to be, while the storms reminded him that the world was bigger and stronger than any fear he had ever carried. But above all, it was the steady and unchanging honesty of the land that captivated him. The mountain never pretended to be anything other than what it was. It did not flatter or manipulate or deceive. It simply existed with a clarity that he longed to mirror in his own life. I think that is why this man, alone in the vast Alaskan wilderness, became so skilled at noticing things that others ignored. He paid attention to the way snow compacted underfoot in early winter compared to late winter. He studied how cold air settled into hollows and rose with the morning sun. He observed the soil, the moss, the movement of animals, the hidden trails carved by winds older than anyone alive today. And because he lived in a place where mistakes could cost more than pride, he learned not only to see but to understand. It is impossible to survive in such a place if you do not listen closely to what the environment teaches you. And he listened every day. It was during one of those long learning years that he came up with an idea many outsiders later called foolish. They looked at the structure he built and shook their heads, convinced that a solitary man had finally allowed the isolation to tilt his judgment. But the man himself never wavered. To him, the idea was not strange. It was simply practical. He had observed the cold, the snow, the movement of ice, the behavior of shadows as the sun moved low on the horizon. And from all these observations, he formed a plan. He would dig into the ground and carve out a place where the cold could live permanently. He would make what he called his ice cellar, though he never used fancy words for it. To him, it was a simple pit deep enough to hold darkness, shielded enough to preserve coldness, and steady enough to ignore the whims of temperature above ground. He had no interest in perfection. He had no need for complex materials. He trusted the cold more than he trusted any modern invention. And so he dug. Day after day, he chipped away at frozen soil and packed snow until he found the depth he needed. When he finished, he sat at the edge of the pit, catching his breath, watching the way the cold settled into it like an invisible fog. It satisfied him. It was humble work, but it suited him. This was a man who believed that true comfort came not from owning things, but from understanding them. That ice cellar, rough and simple as it was, reflected the same principle. Most people down in the towns would never think to rely on a handcrafted ground chamber to keep food chilled for months. They trusted power lines and refrigeration machines. They trusted convenience. But up on the mountain, nothing was convenient. And yet he thrived. He used that cellar to keep fish he had dried in the early summer, to store berries picked when the sun flirted with the horizon for hours, to preserve leftovers from hunts that provided more meat than he needed in a single week. The food lasted through the unpredictable summers when warm spells could melt ice faster than expected. That simple cellar served him well far beyond what his critics had predicted. He told me once that the cellar worked not because it was a clever idea, but because it was built with patience. He did not rush. He did not assume. He tested the air. He observed how long the sun touched different sides of the pit. He adjusted its shape and depth until the cold stayed where he wanted it. For 3 summers, the cellar kept his food safe and fresh, even as the world around him swung between heat and frost. His satisfaction did not come from proving anyone wrong. It came from knowing that he and the mountain had created something together. He had shaped the earth, but the earth had also shaped him. There is something comforting about listening to a man like this speak. His voice carries no bitterness, only the steady warmth of someone who understands what truly matters. He does not raise his voice. He does not apologize for the life he chose. And if you stand beside him on a ridge overlooking a valley drenched in mist, you begin to understand why. The landscape around him is vast enough to hold every thought you have ever been afraid to think. And somehow, it is also gentle enough to remind you that peace is not found in crowds or noise, but in the moments when you allow yourself to breathe slowly. Those who live far from the mountains often imagine that solitude is a kind of suffering. They see emptiness where he sees freedom. They see danger where he sees opportunity. They see loneliness where he feels companionship from the land itself. Listening to him talk about his life, you begin to notice how much of your own restlessness is tied to expectations you never chose for yourself. You begin to wonder what it would feel like to step away from the relentless pace of the world below and instead follow a path that leads toward something quieter, something more honest. Perhaps that is why his story resonates even with people who have never stepped foot in a snowy valley. Deep inside, everyone lies a small desire to slow down, to hear their own thoughts without interruption, to feel connected to something that does not demand constant performance. And in the man who built an ice cellar with his bare hands, in the man who eats by the fire while storms roll overhead, many find a reminder of what they have been missing. When he speaks about his mornings, about waking to the faint creak of ice expanding in the early light, you can almost feel the cool air on your skin. When he describes sitting outside his shelter with a cup of warm broth, watching the long stretch of land fade into the muted colors of dawn, you understand why he never feels alone. The mountain is not a backdrop to him. It is a living presence. It teaches, comforts, pushes, and listens. And he answers with gratitude. As I watched him walk across a patch of uneven snow one morning, I realized that he had something many people spend their entire lives searching for. He had an inner steadiness, a calm certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. There was no regret in his posture, no yearning in his eyes for another kind of life. He had found enough beauty in each hardship that the hardships no longer felt like burdens. They were simply part of a story he had chosen to live. And so this tale begins with a man and a mountain and the remarkable harmony between them. It begins with the kind of simplicity that reveals more truth than complexity ever could. And before we move further into his past and the reasons he embraced solitude, I invite you to let yourself feel what he feels when he wakes in that high place. Feel the clean, cold air. Feel the weight of silence resting gently on your shoulders. Feel the quiet courage of a man who chose peace over noise. If you happen to be listening to this from somewhere far from the cold ridges of Alaska, I would love to know where this story is reaching you. Tell me where in the world you are listening from, so I can imagine this mountain wind traveling all the way to you. There are moments in a man's life when silence becomes louder than the world he left behind. For the hermit of the Alaskan ridges, that silence was not only an escape, but also a consequence, a long echo of choices made years before the first snow ever touched his cabin roof. His past, though rarely spoken of, lived quietly in his gestures, in the way his eyes softened whenever he watched the slow drift of clouds over the peaks. You could tell that he had not come to the mountains merely to hide, but to understand. There was something unresolved behind his calmness, a memory or a series of them that had once burned bright and now rested under layers of quiet acceptance. When he did speak about those years, his words came slow and measured, like someone approaching a sleeping animal, careful not to wake something that had long since lost its anger. He had lived most of his early life near the coast, in a town where the sea dictated everything. The tides determined when men worked, when they rested, and when they feared. His father had been a fisherman, a man whose face was always half hidden under a salt-stained cap, whose hands smelled of the ocean even after days spent ashore. His mother, gentle but tired, spent her days mending nets and her nights waiting for the door to open. It was a small and simple life, but it was also one that demanded constant endurance. The storms there were of a different kind, fierce, sudden, and cruel. Many men went out to sea and never returned. Those who did learned early that nature does not bargain, and that survival depends less on strength than on humility. He grew up watching his father test that balance between man and water, and somewhere in that quiet observation he developed a fascination with endurance. He wondered what made some men return when others did not. He wondered whether courage was born from fear or from peace. By the time he reached his early 30s, he had already worked on the boats, repaired engines, fought winds that seemed capable of breaking the bones of the sky. He had loved once a woman who taught at the small school near the dock, whose laughter could make the hardest day feel lighter. But life in that town had a way of wearing people down. One by one, the faces he knew changed, the conversations grew shorter, and the dreams that had seemed reachable began to dissolve under the repetition of days. There was an accident one winter, not his fault, but his memory carried it like a weight that refused to lift. A storm had come in without warning, faster than the forecasts could predict, and a boat with two of his friends had gone out too far to turn back. He had tried to help. He had done everything right, but the sea had already decided otherwise. Their loss broke something in him that no comfort could repair. After the funerals, after the long weeks of silence when no one knew what to say, he began to feel the walls of his own life closing in. Every sound of wind through the harbor reminded him of that night. Every wave breaking against the rocks carried their names. It was then that he started to wander inland, first for hours, then for days, until one morning he kept walking and simply did not return. Some say that people run from grief, but he would later say that he did not run. He simply followed the quiet until it became a place. The mountains did not ask him questions. They did not remind him of what he had lost. They gave him something else instead, a space large enough to hold his thoughts without drowning in them. At first, he thought he would stay only for a season, just long enough to rest his mind. But the seasons changed, and he did not. He built a small shelter from driftwood and stone, learning as he went, trusting instinct more than knowledge. What began as a temporary refuge turned slowly into a home, and then into a life. There is a strange kind of healing that comes from building with your own hands in a place where no one watches. Each wall, each fire, each repaired roof becomes a declaration that you are still capable of creating something meaningful. He found that by constructing the simplest things, his thoughts began to settle. The rhythm of cutting wood, stacking stones, and shaping paths through the snow became a quiet ritual of recovery. He did not need to speak of his pain anymore. The mountain understood without words. When he looked across the endless horizon of ice and light, he realized that the world was vast enough to hold both his sorrow and his hope, and that neither would cancel the other. The locals in nearby villages sometimes spoke of him as the man who chose solitude over sanity. They imagined him as a ghost wandering through the snow. But those who met him, who actually sat beside his fire, understood differently. He was not a man escaping life. He was a man returning to it. In the simplicity of each day, in the struggle to collect firewood before a storm, in the patience required to catch and preserve food, he rediscovered the dignity of existence, stripped of distractions. He often said that most people carry too many unspoken words, too many promises made to others, but never to themselves. Out there, he learned to keep promises again, not to society, but to the land, to the air, and to his own heart. The mountain taught him about balance, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a daily practice. Some days he would wake to sunlight that melted the edges of snowdrifts, revealing small bursts of moss like green jewels hidden beneath white blankets. Other days the cold would tighten its grip, freezing even the air he breathed. He accepted both as necessary. If the cold was too long, he learned to endure it. If the warmth was too brief, he learned to appreciate it. That quiet endurance reshaped him in ways he did not notice until much later. His old restlessness faded. The guilt that had once weighed him down transformed into gratitude, not because he forgot, but because he finally understood that pain, when faced with patience, becomes wisdom. There was one spring evening when I asked him if he ever missed the company of others. He smiled without turning from the fading horizon and said that company never truly leaves you. It changes form. The people he had loved still lived in his memory, and those memories became companions. He could still hear their voices when he worked, still see their smiles in the dance of light on the snow. Solitude, he said, is not the absence of others, but the presence of yourself. Most people never get to meet that person. The mountain had introduced him to his own company, and he had found it to be good. By the time the third year of his isolation began, he was no longer a visitor. He was part of the mountain's rhythm. He could predict the change of weather from the scent of the air, could tell time by the shadow cast by the ridge across his camp, could sense the movement of animals long before he saw them. What he had lost in noise, he gained in awareness. He often said that people mistake loneliness for emptiness, but the truth is that solitude is full. It's full of detail, of sound, of texture, of meaning. You just have to quiet yourself enough to hear it. The story of his ice cellar began in truth as an extension of this philosophy. It was not just about storing food, it was about trusting the earth to provide stability when everything else was uncertain. His first attempt at digging the cellar was clumsy, shallow, and poorly insulated. The summer heat crept in and spoiled much of what he stored, but instead of frustration he felt curiosity. He observed where the cold held longest, where the shadows lingered, where the permafrost was closest to the surface. Then he began again, deeper this time, shaping the ground to mirror what he had learned. Each adjustment became a lesson in patience. When it finally worked, when the cellar held its chill, even through the bright, endless days of an Alaskan summer, it was more than a practical victory. It was a spiritual one. He had learned how to listen. Over time, that cellar became a symbol of everything he valued: humility, endurance, and understanding. It stood quietly beneath the surface, invisible to anyone passing by, yet vital to his survival. He would often sit near it at dusk, sipping something warm, watching the twilight settle. That humble structure reminded him of himself, sturdy, simple, unseen, but full of quiet purpose. He did not boast about it. He did not need to. The mountain already knew what it meant. When visitors occasionally reached him, curious wanderers, writers, or adventurers, they would ask him the same questions. Why stay here? Why live alone? Why build something so primitive when the world offers so much convenience? He would listen patiently and answer with the same calm certainty, because comfort is not the same as peace, and simplicity is not the same as poverty. The mountain gave him peace because it demanded honesty. You could not pretend here. You either learned to live with what was, or you left. Those words carried the weight of experience. He had seen people chase happiness in noise, in possessions, in constant movement. He had done it himself once. But up there, happiness was quieter. It was found in the slow boiling of snow into drinking water, in the crack of ice splitting under sunlight, in the rare sight of a bird crossing the pale sky. Each moment was enough. He no longer measured life by what he achieved, but by how deeply he felt it. And perhaps that is what drew so many people to his story later on. They saw in him not a recluse, but a reflection of their own longing for stillness. They admired the way he could live without needing to escape from himself. His story reminded them that there is another kind of success, the kind that comes when you stop trying to control everything and begin to listen to the rhythm of the world instead. When he speaks about those first years, his eyes drift somewhere distant, as if he can still see the outline of his old coastal town fading behind a curtain of mist. He no longer feels pain from the memory, only gratitude that it led him here. Without the storm, he says, he might never have learned what it means to be calm. Without loss, he might never have learned the value of keeping. Without noise, he might never have heard silence. So, when you listen to this story, remember that isolation is not always a sign of sadness. Sometimes it is a declaration of peace. Sometimes it is the purest form of presence a person can experience. The man in the Alaskan wilderness is not alone because he has no one. He is alone because he has learned to be complete with himself. And in that quiet completion, there is a wisdom deeper than words. If you are enjoying this story, and if you too have felt that quiet pull toward something simpler, I invite you to stay with me through the next parts of this journey. Subscribe so you can continue walking beside this man and his mountain, and so that each new story finds you wherever you are. When the third winter arrived, the mountain seemed to welcome him not as a guest, but as one of its own. The winds that once felt harsh now moved like slow breaths against his cabin walls, and the long nights, once heavy with silence, became his favorite time of reflection. There is a rhythm in solitude that cannot be rushed. It begins as loneliness, then transforms into quiet, and finally becomes a kind of companionship with everything around you. By that third year, he had reached that final stage. He no longer measured his days by the sun or the calendar. He measured them by the weight of the air, by the sound of snowflakes tapping the roof, by the movement of light through the frost-covered window. Each day carried its own texture, and he learned to recognize the mood of the world through those small, intimate details. Life in silence is not an absence of activity. It is, instead, a different kind of listening. In the cities, people speak to fill the air, to cover their unease with sound. But in the mountains, silence is a living thing. It has depth and movement. It changes tone as the day unfolds. He discovered that silence could teach, could comfort, could even correct him when his thoughts wandered toward impatience. He often said that silence is the most honest companion because it reflects exactly what you bring to it. If your heart is restless, silence becomes unbearable. If your heart is calm, silence becomes a song. And for him, the song grew richer with every passing season. Each morning, he began his day the same way. He would step outside before dawn, even when the cold cut through his clothes, and watch the horizon breathe itself awake. The world was slow at that hour. The sky shifted from black to deep blue, then to the soft silver of early light. He would fill his lungs with air so cold it almost burned, and for a moment he would feel entirely weightless. Sometimes he spoke softly to himself, not out of madness, but as a way of keeping the thread between his thoughts and his voice. He believed that speaking into the vastness helped the mountain know he was still there, still grateful, still alive. Food, water, warmth, and patience were his main concerns. The cellar kept his supplies safe through the thawing months, but even that system required vigilance. When the sun lingered longer than expected and the air softened, he would inspect the edges of the pit, checking for meltwater. He had grown wise enough to see patterns in the smallest things. The smell of damp earth warning of early thaw, the distant crack of ice echoing from the higher ridges signaling that winter was loosening its grip. These were not chores to him. They were rituals, each one reaffirming his connection to the world that sustained him. In those quiet months, he often thought about how little a person truly needs to live well. He had once owned many things, tools, clothes, furniture, keepsakes, but the mountain had taught him that most possessions are just distractions disguised as necessities. He needed only what he could use and what he could repair with his own hands. The fewer things he carried, the lighter he felt. And the lighter he felt, the deeper he could listen to the life around him. He realized that what he had mistaken for comfort in his old life had often been noise. It had dulled his senses, blurred his purpose. Up here, every sound and every decision mattered. Nothing could be ignored, and because of that, everything gained meaning. There were days when clouds covered the entire sky, stretching endlessly like a gray sea above the peaks. On those days, he would stay indoors, tending the fire, sharpening his tools, and writing small notes in an old notebook he had carried since his youth. The pages were filled with sketches of the landscape, fragments of thoughts, and quiet questions he asked himself. What does it mean to live well? How much does a man need to feel whole? Where does peace begin? He did not always find answers, but the questions themselves became part of his prayer. He would pause after writing and listen to the crackle of the fire, as if it were the voice of something older and wiser than himself. When the storms came, the world outside disappeared entirely. Wind howled through the cracks, snow pressed hard against the door, and the cabin trembled as if breathing through the storm's rhythm. Those nights he would sit by the dim light of the fire, wrapped in a blanket, and let his thoughts wander. He did not fear the storms anymore. They were reminders that nothing in nature is constant, that power can coexist with beauty, and that endurance often hides in surrender. When the wind finally faded and silence returned, he would step outside and find the entire world changed, the ground reshaped, the snow polished smooth, the air crisp and alive. Every storm was both destruction and renewal. It cleared not only the land, but also the clutter of his own thoughts. Animals became his silent neighbors. A fox that often passed near his camp, leaving delicate prints in the snow. A raven that seemed to follow him on certain days, circling above and calling out in its sharp, ancient voice. Even a bear once wandered close during the late summer, drawn by the scent of berries stored near his shelter. He respected them all. He never hunted more than he needed, never disturbed their paths, and in return they left him unharmed. There was an unspoken agreement between him and the wild. Each respected the other's place in the balance. That respect became one of his greatest lessons. He learned that the earth responds in kind to how you treat it. Greed invites scarcity. Gratitude invites abundance. During the long nights, when the auroras stretched across the sky, he would step outside and stand motionless beneath the shifting lights. He said those moments were when he felt most alive, when he could almost sense the pulse of the planet beneath his feet. The colors danced in silence, green, violet, and faint gold, like the breath of something divine. Watching them, he would remember how small he was and how vast everything else remained. That realization never frightened him. It brought him peace. To be small was to be free from the burden of control. To belong to something greater than himself was the purest comfort he knew. He rarely thought of the past anymore, but when memories surfaced, they no longer stung. They arrived like gentle visitors, carrying the scent of salt air and the laughter of familiar voices. He would let them stay for a while, then watch them drift away like smoke. In solitude, he had discovered a kind of forgiveness that no conversation could have given him. He forgave the sea, the storm, himself, and even time. He realized that nothing truly disappears. It only changes form. The love he once felt for the people in his old life had not vanished. It had transformed into a quiet compassion that extended to everything he encountered: the wind, the snow, the animals, and even the smallest flicker of life struggling through the cold. As seasons turned, he noticed how his body adapted. His hands became calloused, his skin toughened against frostbite, and his senses sharpened. Hunger no longer frightened him. It simply reminded him to plan better. Cold no longer felt like punishment. It felt like presence. Even pain, when it came, was met with patience. He would tend to wounds slowly, understanding that healing, like everything else in the wild, required time and attention. He stopped fighting discomfort and instead learned to live within it. He once said that the greatest peace he ever found came not from avoiding hardship, but from walking beside it without fear. Visitors still came from time to time. They brought supplies, sometimes letters from distant relatives, though he rarely wrote back. A few were journalists or curious travelers who wanted to hear about the man who lived alone among the ice. He received them kindly but briefly. He never tried to convince anyone to live as he did. He knew solitude was not a prescription. It was a calling, one that could not be taught or forced. When they left, often astonished by how content he seemed, he would smile softly and return to his quiet routines. For him, peace was not something to explain. It was something to live. His ice cellar continued to serve him through those years, its walls solid and reliable, its cold steady, even when the sun grew strong. It became not just a place to store food, but a metaphor for his entire way of life. It represented preparation, humility, and faith in natural order. Every time he opened it, feeling the breath of frozen air rise up, he was reminded that wisdom often hides in the simplest acts. What others called primitive, he called true. What others found difficult, he found meaningful. He sometimes thought about death, not with fear, but with curiosity. He said that living so close to nature makes you understand how natural endings are. The trees fall, the snow melts, the rivers freeze and thaw, and everything continues in new forms. He believed that when his time came, the mountain would know what to do with him. It would return his body to the same ground that had kept him alive for so long. That thought comforted him. There was no tragedy in it, only completion. One evening, as we watched the last light fade behind the ridge, he said something that stayed with me. He said that modern life teaches people to seek meaning in faraway places, but meaning is always closest when you stop searching. He had found his in the sound of snow melting, in the smell of pine smoke, in the small satisfaction of a well-built shelter. He said that happiness is not a goal, but a byproduct of attention. When you truly pay attention, even the simplest life becomes extraordinary. As I listened to him, I realized that what he had created in those mountains was not isolation, but harmony. He had replaced the noise of society with the music of wind and water. He had traded conversation for understanding. And in doing so, he had become something most of us forget to be: present. The silence around him was not emptiness. It was full of stories, of movement, of quiet grace. And so his life in silence continued, not as withdrawal, but as a deep return to the essence of being alive. He was no longer the man who fled from grief, but the man who had transformed it into wisdom. His days blended into one another in a peaceful rhythm: wake, work, watch, rest, and dream. He had become part of the mountain's memory, as constant as the wind, as patient as the snow. If this peace he found speaks to something within you, stay close to this story. There is still more to learn from him and the mountain. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this journey, where the quiet will be tested and the man will discover that even peace has its trials. The fourth year brought a different kind of challenge, one that tested not only his endurance, but also the quiet balance he had built with the mountain. Challenges in such a place never announce themselves. They arrive disguised as small changes in weather, in sound, in scent. It began one spring morning when the melt came too early. The snow that had blanketed the slopes started retreating fast, revealing wet patches of dark soil long before it should have. The river, usually a steady companion of slow trickles, swelled with restless energy. The air itself seemed confused, heavy one day and hollow the next. He had learned long ago that unusual patterns meant something deeper was shifting, and so he watched, listened, and waited. The mountain speaks in whispers. It tells you when something is wrong, but you have to be still enough to hear it. He noticed that the frost line in his ice cellar began to rise sooner than expected. Water droplets gathered where there had never been moisture before. His first instinct was not fear, but curiosity. He knew that nature changes its rules from time to time, and that survival depends not on resistance, but on adaptation. Still, This was new. For the first time, the balance he had relied upon seemed uncertain. He spent hours inspecting the structure, tracing his fingers along the cold walls, listening to the subtle sound of dripping that came from somewhere below. The cellar that had served him faithfully for years was beginning to thaw. At first, he thought it was a small inconvenience. He removed what he could, preserved the food by drying it, and dug trenches around the cellar to redirect the meltwater. But the ground continued to soften. The permafrost that had always been his ally was giving way under the unexpected warmth. The world was shifting faster than he had ever seen it do. Some might have seen disaster in this, but he saw a lesson. He said that the earth was teaching him once again not to trust permanence. Nothing remained still, not even ice. For days he worked tirelessly, not with frustration, but with focused calm. He cut new channels for drainage, reinforced the cellar walls with slabs of stone, and adjusted its opening to catch less sunlight. Each evening he would sit outside, hands rough and cracked from cold water, watching the mist rise from the valley below. He was older now, but still strong, still steady. The work reminded him that every comfort he had built in that place was born from challenge. The cellar had once been his triumph over isolation, but now it would become his teacher once more. One afternoon, while resting by the river, he noticed that the water carried more sediment than usual, thick and gray. He followed it upstream and discovered that a section of the ridge had collapsed, a minor landslide caused by thawing ground. Trees had tilted, their roots exposed like wounded nerves. It was a stark reminder of how fragile even the most solid-seeming earth could be. He spent that evening in deep thought, sitting quietly by his fire. The world was changing around him, and though he had found peace in stillness, he realized that peace must also move when the world moves. The next morning, he began to design a new system, not to replace the cellar, but to extend its purpose. He dug deeper, seeking colder ground. He built channels lined with stone so that cold air from the shaded slopes could circulate freely. He worked with the mountain, not against it, letting gravity and natural airflow become part of the design. The work took weeks, perhaps months, though time had little meaning up there. When it was done, he had something different, not just a storage pit, but a structure that breathed with the land. It used the same principle as his old cellar, but adapted to the new rhythm of the earth. It was crude, yes, but effective. And when he tested it, storing meat and fish inside, he found that the cold returned. The mountain had accepted his adjustment. That success filled him not with pride, but with gratitude. He knew that nothing he built could ever truly control nature. It could only cooperate with it. He often said that people in the modern world confuse mastery with understanding. They think to master something is to own it, when in truth, the highest form of mastery is to listen deeply enough to move with it. His cellar had not survived because he had conquered the mountain. It had survived because he had learned to move in harmony with it. But the challenge did not end there. That summer turned out to be the warmest he had ever experienced in Alaska. The air shimmered with heat he had never felt before, and insects, once rare in such altitude, began to appear. His food needed even more care. The ground softened under his boots in places that had always been firm. He noticed cracks forming in distant cliffs where none had been before. He began to understand that this was not an isolated season. It was part of a greater transformation. Nature itself was shifting. The balance between cold and warmth, between endurance and rest, was rewriting itself. One night, as he sat watching the horizon glow faintly under the endless sun, he thought about time. He realized that the mountain, too, was alive and aging, just as he was. The ice, the stone, the soil, they all moved in slow rhythms of birth and decay. He felt strangely comforted by that idea. It meant that his presence there was not accidental. It was part of a much larger cycle. The warmth that threatened his cellar was the same warmth that would eventually bring new life to the valleys below. Change was not the enemy. It was simply the next chapter. Still, the adjustments required energy. His body ached more than it once did, and rest came slowly. The mountain had given him everything, but it had never promised ease. He reminded himself daily that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the acceptance of it. And so, through long days and shorter nights, he worked, he learned, and he adapted again and again. There came a day late in the season when the cellar failed completely. He woke to find water seeping across the floor, his stores damp, the cold gone. It was a moment that might have broken a younger version of himself, but instead he sat there for a while, just listening to the sound of dripping water. Then he smiled, faintly. He realized that he no longer depended on that cellar the way he once had. It had served its purpose, but now it was time to let it go. The lesson it had carried had already taken root in him. The earth gives and takes. What remains constant is the understanding you build along the way. He spent the following weeks drying and smoking what he could, adjusting his routines, finding new ways to preserve food in the open air. He moved his supplies higher, closer to the wind, where the air stayed cooler. What had once been a single solution became a dozen small ones. He called it a conversation with the mountain, each problem a question, each solution an answer whispered by the wind. The challenge that others would call loss had become, for him, a renewal. It was during those same months that he made a discovery he would never forget. One morning, while exploring a shaded ravine, he found a small hollow where the air was colder than anywhere else around. He knelt down and realized that ice still lingered there, hidden beneath moss and rock, untouched by the warming sun. It was nature's own cellar, formed without tools, without plans. He laughed softly, the sound echoing through the stillness. The mountain had always known what he was trying to build. He had only been copying its wisdom. In that discovery, he felt a joy that words cannot describe. The joy of recognizing that the world already holds the answers we seek, if only we stop to notice them. From then on, he visited that hollow often. He used it as a natural storehouse, but more than that, he treated it as a place of reflection. It became a symbol of humility, a reminder that nature does not need improvement. It needs respect. He said that the cellar he built had been his creation, but the cellar he found had been the mountain's gift. That gift, small and hidden, taught him once more what it means to live in harmony with something larger than yourself. The discovery came at a time when he needed reassurance that his way of life still made sense. The world below, as he occasionally heard from travelers, was changing faster than ever. Machines grew louder, people moved quicker, and silence had become a rare thing. He could not imagine living among that noise again. He understood now that simplicity was not backwardness. It was preservation. The same way his ice cellar had preserved food, his solitude preserved meaning. It kept his mind from spoiling under the rush of modern life. That summer, as the nights remained short and the air heavy with warmth, he spent long hours reflecting on his years there. He thought about the man he had been when he first arrived, tired, broken, uncertain, and compared him to the man he had become, steady, humble, whole. The difference was not something time had done to him, but something the mountain had revealed in him. The peace he found was not given. It was uncovered, layer by layer, like ice beneath snow. When the first snow of autumn returned, light and silent, he stood outside and watched it fall onto the warm ground. The flakes melted almost immediately, but he knew the cold would return soon enough. "Everything moves in cycles," he said, "even faith." That night he sat by the fire, looking toward the place where his old cellar once stood. He felt no regret. The ice had melted, but the lesson remained frozen in him forever. That was enough. If you find meaning in his resilience, if you too believe that wisdom grows from listening to what the world is trying to tell you, stay close to this story. Subscribe and keep walking this path with him, because what comes next will show how peace survives even when tested by time, and how a man who built his life in silence discovers that the greatest strength lies in gentleness. Years passed quietly after that summer of warmth and change. The man and the mountain settled into a new rhythm together, slower perhaps, but even more harmonious than before. Time no longer felt like a straight line to him. It moved in circles, like the wind tracing patterns through the snow, like the river that froze, thawed, and froze again. He had stopped counting winters, though his beard grew whiter, and his hand showed the story of a lifetime carved into their lines. To anyone else, those years might have seemed uneventful, but to him they were full of depth. Each day, each season, each silence had its own meaning. Life in that stillness had become a conversation between him and the world, one that never really needed words. There was a kind of wisdom in his solitude that few people ever reach, a clarity that comes only when you have stripped life down to its essence. He said once that most people live surrounded by mirrors that reflect their own noise back to them until they mistake the echoes for truth. Out there were no mirrors, only distance and light, only the slow heartbeat of the earth. He began to understand that the mountain was not simply a place, but a teacher, and that every hardship it offered was a lesson in disguise. The warmth that melted his cellar had taught him humility. The storms that bent the trees had taught him resilience. The silence that filled the endless nights had taught him presence. Nothing was wasted. Every experience, even the smallest, carried meaning. He found himself thinking often about the people below, those still living in towns and cities, moving endlessly from one task to the next, their eyes fixed on clocks and screens. He did not judge them. He had once been one of them. But he wondered whether they could still hear the sound of their own lives beneath all the noise. He believed that the human heart was not made for constant interruption. It was meant to move slowly, like the rhythm of breath, like the turning of seasons. Up here, he could feel that rhythm clearly. Down there, it was easy to forget it existed. Sometimes, during long evenings by the fire, he would speak softly about the world as he imagined it had become. He would talk about the hunger for attention, the loneliness that hides inside crowds, the way people chase meaning through things instead of through understanding. He said that people had mistaken abundance for fulfillment. They filled their homes with possessions, but left their souls empty. He did not speak with bitterness. He spoke with compassion. He had been lost in that same noise once, and he knew how difficult it was to find stillness again. The mountain had given him that chance, but he knew not everyone could walk away so completely. That was why he told his story, to remind others that silence is not only found in remote places, it can be found anywhere you are willing to stop and listen. One winter, a small group of visitors reached his cabin. They were young, curious, carrying cameras and notebooks, hoping to capture a glimpse of the famous hermit who had built an ice cellar that outlasted the odds. They asked him endless questions about loneliness, about fear, about purpose. He answered each one patiently, though sometimes his responses puzzled them. When one asked how he could bear being so far from everyone, he smiled and said, "That distance is not measured in miles, but in attention. You can be surrounded by people and still be alone, or you can stand in silence and feel the whole world beside you." Another asked him what he missed most from his old life, and he thought for a long moment before saying, "I miss nothing, because everything that mattered has followed me here." They wrote down his words carefully, as if they were instructions, but he never meant them as lessons. He was only describing what he had come to know. When the visitors left, he felt no longing for their company. He simply wished them peace. He knew that most of them would return to their world unchanged, but maybe one or two would remember something. The stillness in the air, the calm in his eyes, and perhaps they would carry a little of that silence back with them. He said once that if even one person learns to listen more deeply because of his story, then his years of solitude have served a greater purpose. As the winters grew softer, he noticed more signs of change in the land. The river flowed longer before freezing. The birds returned earlier. Even the moss grew thicker on the north side of the rocks. It was as if the mountain itself was evolving into something new. He did not resist it. He had long ago accepted that change is the nature of all things. But it made him thoughtful. He wondered what the world would become when he was gone, whether there would still be people who looked at the land with reverence, who treated it not as a resource, but as a companion. He hoped so. He believed that as long as one person still listened, the balance could be restored. He began to write more in his old notebook, though the pages were nearly full. His handwriting had grown slower, his letters larger. He wrote not for anyone else, but for himself, to record the small truths he had learned through living quietly. He wrote about patience, how it can turn fear into understanding. He wrote about gratitude, how even hunger can feel sacred when you recognize it as life reminding you of itself. He wrote about time, how it does not move forward but inward, how every year spent in silence adds another layer to the soul instead of to the calendar. He wrote until his fingers ached and his candle burned low, and then he closed the book with a quiet sense of completion. That spring, he walked farther than usual, exploring areas he had not visited in years. The snow was thin, the air mild. He climbed slowly along the ridge, stopping often to rest and look around. The world below was vast, stretching endlessly in shades of white and gray. From up there, even the wind sounded softer. He felt something inside him shift, an understanding that his time was beginning to slow, that his body could no longer match the endurance of his spirit. But there was no sadness in that realization. He believed that life's true beauty lies in knowing when to stop resisting its natural rhythm. Everything that rises must one day rest. And he had learned to rest without regret. He often said that the purpose of solitude is not escape, but perspective. You go into silence not to hide, but to see more clearly. He had come to the mountains to heal, and in healing he had discovered truth. Now that truth was complete. He could feel it in his bones, in his breath, in the way the world seemed to meet him halfway in every moment. He said that he no longer prayed for more years, only for the grace to live each day as if it were enough. And it always was. During the last summer, he spent fully alone. He began to notice how alive the nights had become. The air carried the sound of distant water, and the sky glowed faintly even after midnight. He would sit outside for hours, his old mug in hand, watching the slow turning of stars. Sometimes he would talk to them quietly, thanking them for their light. He said they had been his oldest friends. When the wind picked up, he would whisper to the mountain too, telling it that he was grateful, that everything it had given him would live on in his heart. He believed that gratitude, when spoken aloud, strengthens the bond between man and world. He felt that connection growing stronger as his days grew shorter. There were moments when he would recall the people he had once loved, their faces blurred now by time, their voices like echoes in water. He no longer missed them in the way he once had. Instead, he felt them with him always. He said that love does not end when presence ends. It only changes direction. It becomes quieter, deeper, more like light than sound. In the silence, he could feel that light everywhere. The world, he said, is made entirely of memory and breath. And when you finally stop trying to separate yourself from it, you realize you were never truly alone. He looked at his old cellar one morning, half sunken and moss-covered, and felt a surge of affection for it. It had been his teacher, his companion, his proof that even a stupid idea could hold wisdom if approached with care. It had kept him alive, yes, but more importantly, it had shown him that simplicity, patience, and listening could outlast even the hardest winters. The ice had melted, but the idea behind it would never fade. He smiled at the thought that somewhere, someday, someone might build their own version of it, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to live closer to the truth. By now, his hair was silver and his steps slower, but his eyes still carried the brightness of early morning. He continued to work each day, tending to the fire, fetching water, preparing small meals. His movements were deliberate, graceful in their simplicity. Watching him, you could see the kind of peace that only comes from complete acceptance. He was not waiting for anything. He was simply being. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, he spoke words that I never forgot. He said, "The world doesn't need saving. It only needs remembering." At first, I didn't understand, but over time his meaning became clear. He meant that the wisdom we seek has always been here, in the wind, in the soil, in the rhythm of the seasons. We forget it because we drown in noise. Remembering is not about finding something new. It's about returning to what was always true. That was his gift, his message. Not that solitude is superior, but that attention is sacred. As the night grew darker, he sat in silence, watching the stars rise one by one. He said he could feel the pulse of the world inside him, steady and calm. For him, there was no separation anymore between man and mountain, between body and spirit. They had become one. If you have stayed with this story until now, it means you too have felt something awaken, a small pull toward stillness, a quiet memory of peace. Stay with it. Let it grow. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so that you can continue this journey, because the final chapter of his story is not about survival anymore. It's about legacy and what remains when a man becomes part of the mountain itself.